Paul certainly knew the real Christ, he had to meld his understanding with the Judaic belief in a Messiah, someone sent to save Israel and establish a kingdom on earth. Given his Judaic monotheism, however, Paul certainly never believed the uncreated could become the created, or that God could empty itself of its divine nature to become anything. As said, for God to create and unite itself to man's human nature cost God nothing. This was solely an act of God's goodwill, even. God's esteem for the marvel of its own creation, man. But since God cannot become anything or be emptied of anything, what then emptied itself? Based solely on his own experience, Paul knew enough about God to know that no human being could remain on this earth and exist in God's glory at the same time. As someone rapt to the third heaven, who didn't know if he was in the body or out of the body, he knew man's heavenly and earthly existence were incompatible. So based on his own experience of being rapt to the third heaven, and then having to return to ordinary life, this come down was literally a kenosis. Just so we're clear, boys and girls, she's speaking from experience. And if you know of any other Christian writer who writes from experience about the kenosis, please let me know in the comments. Being emptied of a glorious existence in God can only be called a letdown, a descent from a taste of glory to an inglorious existence in this world. Thus he relates his own experience to the necessity of man or spirit being emptied of God's glory in order to live on earth, live as one of the multiple. No question, Paul based his whole understanding of Christ on his own revealing experiences. His problem was trying to make it suit the Gentile mentality and at the same time fit into his Judaic belief system. Better had he stuck only with what God had revealed to him. I think we should remember that Paul spent 2 years in Damascus after being blinded by the light that he identified as Christ. Perhaps he stayed blind for months, we don't know. But it was 2 years is a long time that he took to come up with all of this. The feat of the incarnation then was not God creating its own human nature or affecting an eternal union with man. To reveal this truth, however, the feat was God's own human nature forfeiting its glorious life in God to live an inglorious life in this world. This kenosis, emptying, was solely on the part of God's universal human nature, certainly not on the part of God's divine nature, nor on the part of any individual or particular person. The feat, then, was God's universal human nature having to become an individual being in this world and consequently to become its own person. This descent from God is actually the reverse of man's ascent to God. Where this descent was taking on the life of an individual person, man's ascent to God is being emptied of his individual person, emptied in order to become not his own, but become God's universal humanity. This latter kenosis was the very nature of Jesus' death. Death being the individual, death of the individual person, Jesus. And so it goes for every human being. We'll talk more about the death of Christ, not the death of Jesus, in a future chapter. Kenosis, then, was God's universal human nature becoming an individual being, one of the multiple, its own person, a relative nondescript in this world. So a kenosis is what it took for God's universal human nature to leave its eternal life in God and take up an indefinite life in this world. To be an individual in this world means, of course, becoming one's own person, i.e., being aware of one's own being, me, myself, and I. So where God's universal human nature in God is not aware of its own being, no me, myself, and I, yet to be an individual in this world requires one to be aware of his own being, his own independent existence. Just to function in this world, every man has to be free to be his own self, his own individual person. Such, at least, did God ordain it to be. The reason for this kenosis is that man's common human nature conceived in God's divine modus operandi, the Trinity, is not remotely prepared or equipped to live under any earthly conditions. Those who think earthly existence is compatible with life in God's heavenly dimension will never understand the eternal Christ. In fact, the sole reason for speaking of heaven, man's eternal life with God, is because it is not life on this earth, or even remotely like earthly existence. It is because these two lives have little in common that there is the phenomenon called death. There is no other reason for death than the entrance into eternal life in God. The more people think these two existences, heaven and earth, have in common, the less they know God and Christ. We'd even say the less they know human nature and themselves. So, as always, as frequently we find in this book, she's appealing to her the authority of her own experience. Here's a note that I wrote at the bottom of page 305. Kenosis proves God has no self because it was about taking on the horrible condition of having a self or human consciousness. Kenosis then actually affirms the tremendous difference between the essence of man's eternal union with God and an individual person's union with God. Kenosis was a descent from participating in God's heavenly existence to participating in man's earthly existence. No individual person underwent this kenosis. Rather, it was what man is, the essence of man, that underwent this kenosis to become who some individual person was. This ordeal, then, was not on the part of any individual human being or person, but solely on the part of God's common human essence prior to being an individual person. Thus, because it was no one's experience, it can be best regarded as an inhuman event. Inhuman because it was not the experience of any individual human being. Rather, kenosis was man's universal nature becoming an individual person. She refers specifically to it being an inhuman event when she talks in I forget which book it was where she describes all this. Anyway, it is because the human nature God united to itself was not that of a particular human being or person that in order to reveal this union, it was necessary man's universal nature become an individual person in this world. How else could God reveal this eternal heavenly union to man in this world? Kenosis then was the forfeiture of man's eternal life in God in order to take on life in this world as one of the many. This meant coming out of or down from man's glorious existence in God to being an individual man in an inglorious world. This, however, was not some instantaneous or overnight miracle, but the most terrible ordeal human nature could undergo. It might be compared to crossing over a chasm, no man's land, between created and uncreated. To put a finger on this god-awful ordeal, one can put his finger on the line, Christ, and then move it down into the world of multiple beings. This descent falls outside anything man could experience or compare it to. This is beyond all man's notions of suffering, spiritual and physical, even beyond his worst notions of hell. Because it was not the experience of any individual person, it can only be called inhuman and ungodly. The fathers were right to understand this come down or kenosis as Christ's true sacrifice, and not the crucifixion and death of Jesus. In truth, the sacrifice was God's own humanity putting off its glorious life in God to become an individual human being, a particular person. This was not the experience of any individual person, but of the essence of man prior to being an individual person. This was not then the experience of Jesus or any individual person. Prior to his conception and birth, Jesus never